is Ben, and this is an introduction to Django. We'll be going over from installing Python on your computer to deploying to a website. Here's what I look like for the very curious, but I don't see any reason to keep that going through the whole series. So I'll just make that go away. All right, in this first video, we're going to go over installing Python onto your computer, setting up a virtual environment, and starting a Django project and an app. In the following on videos, well, the overhaul for the whole series will be making a project by following Django's tutorial. And then we'll make another project. This is a project that I'm actually working on. It's a display board for my department's projects. And we're going to deploy that second project on a low-cost VPS. It's a virtual public server. And we'll go over getting a server set up and getting a URL. All right, I have some expectations that you have enough experience with coding to know at least what a function is, what a class is. You have to be ready to type code and use the command line because this is not about pointing and clicking, and that you're comfortable with your computer. You can download software, navigate files, just the basic stuff like that. And with that, let's get started. I'm going to start by running the command line. And since this laptop does not have Python installed, if I type Python, that's going to bring me right to the Windows Store. And from there, I will install Python. If you go back to the command line, I type Python again. And here I am in the command interpreter. Now, we're going to be using this Django tutorial to start our first project. What the Django tutorial does not cover is virtual environments. I think they should. So we're going to start setting up the virtual environment. If we take a look at my directory structure, I've got all of my projects and stuff in this directory called coding. And then I have projects for my projects in a separate folder for virtual environments. A lot of folks will put the virtual environment right in the project. That is fine too. This is just my preference. I like to keep my virtual environment folder separate. And what a virtual environment will have is a lot of settings and a lot of software that you're going to download into this virtual environment. And it will apply only to the project that you're working on. And that way, if you're working on more than one project, your second project might have a different set of dependencies. Some dependencies might be incompatible with others, so virtual environments are a way to keep all that separate. At any rate, I'm going to go back to our command line here and start a virtual environment. I'm going to move into my virtual environment directory. And I should say this, if you Google virtual environments, Python virtual environments Windows, it'll bring you to this page, and this will give you the command for starting your virtual environment. And that's Python 3-n venv, followed by the path to the new virtual environment, with the end of that path being the new directory that you're going to create. And just so you can see what that did, we'll go back into my folder. And as you see, well, this was already there before. What we just created was this virtual environment right here. And in this virtual environment are, basically it's a lot of software that's already been installed. Now, in order to start coding within our virtual environment, we have to activate it. And that is done with this command. In Windows, that command is the path to the virtual environment appended by scripts, appended by the word activate. And that refers to a file called activate.bat. There I got my slashes backwards. All right, and as you see, we started a virtual environment. The name of the virtual environment will be right before the command prompt. The next step will be to install Django, and the Python command for installing is pip. We'll do pip install Django. And Python is recommending that I upgrade pip, so I'm just going to go ahead and do exactly what they tell me to do, so why not? Now, just to see exactly where all this got installed, remember we were in the coding virtual environments, we were in the My Site virtual environment, and then under site packages, we could see that Django got installed, along with some dependencies, along with some things that Django depends on. Now, we're not going to be doing any coding inside of this virtual directory. Well, the coding is going to be in the projects directory. Now, if you take a look at the Django tutorial, it'll tell you to go into the directory where you want to store this project and issue this command, Django admin start project my site. And you would issue that command in your project directory. But I'm going to do something slightly different. And what I like to do is create my project directory first. And from inside this folder that I've created, I'm just going to add this period to indicate that that I'm creating the project in this directory that I've already created. And the reason I like to do that is because on some systems where you might be working, you might be sharing directories with other folks, and setting up the permissions on your specific directory can sometimes be a pain in the butt. And it's better to create that directory first, get all the permissions set up, and then move into that directory to start your project. If you're just doing this on your laptop, it's not necessary. It will be the same result no matter what. And I'll show you that right now. So now we go into our projects directory. This is the directory that I created manually. And as you see, there's another subdirectory in there also called My Site. This is your project directory. This here is your root directory, or your project root directory. And that is the normal Django structure, to have a root directory with the name of your project, and a project directory with the same name inside that root directory. And inside this root directory is also going to be some other files. When you just start, you're going to see this one, manage.py. And this file is basically a command file. You'll be using that a lot to create your apps and do a bunch of other stuff. And this structure would be the same whether I created the root directory manually as I did, and then pathed in and used start project with a dot. It would have been the same had I issued this command without the dot from the projects directory. Let me apologize real quickly because I know that that I keep referring to this one as the project directory. It's the project root directory. This is the project directory. All right, so let's take a look at the next step from our Django tutorial. All right, well, in the tutorial, they want to point out that inside of the project directory, that's the actual project directory, there's also these files. When you have a Django project, you're going to be doing a little bit of work on URLs and settings. These other files you're not going to be doing that much with. What these do is they help start the web server. And the next thing that the tutorial goes over basically is to have you start a development server just so you can verify that your installation works. And for that, we go back to our command line. We make sure that we are in the project root folder, and from there we can issue this command. All right, and this managed PI is, we just referred to that file that we're going to be using a lot to start the server, start apps, doing all that other kind of stuff. And as you see, when we started this development server, it gave us this URL, which is a local URL. It refers only to what's on your computer. But you could start a browser and go to that URL. And if you see this page, it means that Django was installed. And going back to the tutorial, the next step will be to start an app. An app is where most of your work is going to be getting done. So whatever thing that you're going to be making, whatever project you want to work on, let's say you want to make yourself a blog, chances are you're going to have a project folder, which you're going to call something like Joe's site or Joe's stuff. And in that is going to be the app, which will be your blog, like Joe's blog. In this case, their project, in this tutorial, the project is my site, and the app is polls. So what we're going to do is go back to the command line, back to the root folder, and I just hit Control-C to exit out of the development server. Back to the root folder, and we'll issue the command. The command is python manage.py start app polls. Back to our project folder, our project root folder. Our project folder is still there, but now we have this new app folder called polls. And inside there, a bunch of files that we need to write our app. Also, if you notice up here, it created a database, DB SQLite 3. That's where all of our data is going to be stored. Now, if you want to use another database system, MySQL, Postgre, whatever, you can change that in the settings. But by default, the database system is going to be SQLite 3, and the database file will be right here in the root folder. And this first view that they're going to have you write is not something that's going to be used in your app, but they just want to start with something simple so that they can show you some other concepts. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Now to start coding, I'm going to start up Visual Studio Code. You could use any IDE. You can even use a text editor if you want, but VS Code is free. It's very powerful. It's pretty popular. Open up a folder. Now the start app command already created a file called views.py. But the template or the original views.py isn't exactly what they want us to write in this tutorial. So we're going to import HTTP response from Django HTTP. It's not exactly what they wrote there. Let's see. But it's close enough. Now, as I say in the tutorial, you need a URL. This view won't run by itself. It needs a URL, and you're going to have to call that URL from your browser. So in order to map it to a URL, we're going to map a URL. We're going to map the view to a URL by editing the URLs file in the polls app. Now, the start app command did not create a URLs file, which is interesting because almost every tutorial I've seen says you need to put a URLs file in your app. But it's not there automatically, so we'll have to create it. And as is pretty standard, we're going to import path. Right? And the main part of a URLs file is this here, these URL patterns. In this case, we're just going to have one pattern so far, but we will add many more to these. Editor is trying to do too much. All right, so now we have a URL, and this is an empty URL. And from your browser, it's still going to start off with 127.0.0.1, etc. And this will refer to the views. That's the views in this app directory. This, in other words, this file here, views index, the function that we just wrote, and we're going to give it a name that we can refer to in other parts of the code, and that the name of this path will be index. But this still isn't ready to work. There's a couple of other things that we have to do before we can punch this URL into our browser. We're going to have to go back to our project, my site, and edit the URLs folder there. In the project, up here in the project, the URLs file was automatically created. It's just not automatically created in the app. All right, so a quick look back in the tutorial. This is the project folder, the URLs file inside the project folder. All this text up here is just for you to read, but we don't really need that right now. The Django start project command automatically created an admin path for us. But first, we're going to need a way to point to our polls app. In order to include URLs from your apps, we also need to import include. All right, in order to see what we've done, go ahead and start the development server again. And then go to our browser and as you see, this is the text returned by our function. And this polls here is this polls right here. It's the path that's in our projects folder, and this refers to the URLs that's in our app folder, which in return refers to the function that we created in our views file. And the first part is going to be settings on how you would set this up for databases other than SQLite 3. Quick introduction to your settings file. And over here they talk about this migrate command. When we installed Django, a lot of code is already written for us. And some of that code defined models which will correspond to tables that are going to go into our database. But those models aren't yet in the database. I have a SQLite utility installed on this computer that'll allow us to take a look at the database. I was afraid I was going to do that. Got my slashes wrong. we take a look at the tables that are in the database, we can see that there are none. Now go back to the command line, Control-C to stop the server, and run the command python manage.py migrate. Okay, did the migrate command, and it created a bunch of tables in our database. Go back to my utility. And you can see the various tables, authorization tables for logging in, logging off users, session tables for storing session information, and stuff like that. These tables are referred to, or they're designed by what Django calls models, and we're going to start putting models in our polls app and add our own tables. All right, back to the tutorial. The start app command did create a models file. And in that now empty file, we're going to define the classes that are defined in the tutorial. And you know, I don't really type this fast. And so we've just defined two classes, question and choice. Both of these are subclasses of model, which is defined in Django DB models. And Django defines for us several classes that we can use to create our fields, such as a character field, integer field. Also this foreign key, by which we can refer to one model in another model. And so as you see here in our choice class, this foreign key refers to a question. So each choice will be associated with a question. Now, in order for these models to be translated into tables in our database, and in fact, in order to make anything in your app work, you have to add it to settings.py. And if you look at the tutorial here, they're adding it right into installed apps, right on top of these other apps here. See, obvious difference between any app that we write and any app that came pre-installed as part of Django is that all of these other apps refer to the Django contrib and our app. And the entry for our app is going to refer to this polls config class in this apps file. And just to show you what that is, we go back here, go back to our polls app. This is apps.py. And when we hit the start app command, it created this polls config class. And this polls config class is what we're putting into settings.py. Now, in order to get this to work, we have to do two things. One is we have to make migrations, and then we have to run the migrate command, the same migrate command that we ran before. Now they write manage.py, make migrations, polls. If you had other apps in there and you didn't want to include those other apps for some reason in this migrations, then you can specify polls. I usually don't bother with that, especially if I'm only working with one app. So I'm just going to go back to my command line. And again, I didn't need to specify polls. Polls is the only app that we've been working on. So those are the only migrations that need to be made. And what this command did is it created an entry in the migrations directory. Go back to File Manager and take a look at that. And that's the file that we created. That's what the file looks like. So when we go back to the command prompt, and run the migrate command, it applies the migrations file that we just created. And if we take a look at our database, and we could see that it created the tables. All right, the next section in the tutorial has you playing around with the API. We're going to skip that and move right on to the section about the admin. Django has an excellent admin interface which you can use to add and remove users or any other models that you defined in your apps. But in order to get there, you have to log on. You don't have any users in your project yet, so you got to create your first user from the command line. And you do that with the command python manage.py create superuser. So if we go to our command prompt, python, you give your user any name, but we'll use admin for this app. I'm just going to use my email address. All right, gotta have a decent password, otherwise it'll ping you. So I'm going to come up with all right. Now we have a user and we can log into our admin app. We do that, or we can log into our admin panel. We do that, well, first by running the server again. Okay, with the server running. It's our base URL plus admin. All right, and now we have users, and there's one user, the one that we just added. All right, back to the tutorial. We did all this. And the next section is to make the model that we defined modifiable by the admin. And here we'll go back to our IDE. And in our app, the polls app, there is a file called admin.py. Django already started us off here, but we need to import the model that we want to add to the admin panel. All right. From our local models, we're going to import a question, and then I'm going to do admin site register question. And that is all that needed. If we refresh our admin page here, you'll notice questions came right up. Now, in the tutorial, there's already a question in there. You created that, well, people following the tutorial created that while they were playing around with the interface. I'm sorry, the API. We didn't do that, so we don't have any questions here yet. But we can add a question. Now, What's being displayed here, question object 1, is different from what they have displayed. What's up, which is more helpful, and I know why. It's because back in the section where they were playing around with the API, they also made a modification to the model that, well, I skipped over that part, but let's go ahead and fix that now. So what we're going to do is define str. Right, and what this str function is, well, basically defines what will be returned if you just refer to the model itself. And simply by adding that line, we could go back to our admin, refresh, and there it is. Not sure where that caret came from. Let's see. Oh, I must have typed it in accidentally. Okay, so now I'll fix it. Now at this point, we still don't have a functioning app that anybody can use. The next section will cover some views that your visitors can see, and we'll go over templates. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to have us do is add a few more views. Now once again, these are just, they're not part of any real app, they're just placeholders so that you can test out the views and the URLs. But I'm going to go ahead and add these in. I'm going to go ahead and copy all this. And then the URLs file, the URL patterns to match. Now if you take a look at this part of the path in the angle brackets, this is how you pass variables to your function from the URL. So to show you that, we'll make sure the server is running. This number 5 here is this part in our path. This path referred to the detail function in our views file, and it says you are looking at question ID, and that's what was returned in our view. It's still not a web app that does anything, but it does show how Django gets variables passed to functions, and that will be very important later. Now, I'm going to skip down to the part where they talk about writing templates. If you take a look at this directory pattern, polls, templates, polls, and index.html, this redundancy is something you will get used to working with Django, and it helps their system find the files that it needs. So back in our IDE, we're going to create this file, polls, templates, polls, index.html. So making sure I'm in my polls directory, enter new directory, and from inside that templates directory, another directory redundantly named polls. And from there, a new file called index.html. And from here we can copy and paste from their example. And taking a look at their templating language, we have these commands in this curly brace and percentage, and then the opposite curly brace, percentage and the curly brace. That's the start of a Django template command. And the language is pretty easy to understand. If there's a latest question list, and then for each question in that list, display this. Now this, with the two curly braces, is a special command. This just means to print, to display something on the screen. So for every question in the latest question list, print href polls, then the question ID, then the question text. Else, if there are no questions in the question list, no polls are available. Now this template doesn't do anything by itself. We have to tell the view to use that template. All right, let's skip over this one and go right into the version that has the render command in it. All right, now this import was already in there when we used the start app command, so Django put that in there for us. So all we have to do is redo this index. So I'm going to go back to my file, into the views, delete the old index, and copy the lines from the new index. And we need to import question from our models. All right, there's a lot going on here. First, we're defining a variable, latest question list. In Python, there's no var declaration. You just go ahead and name your variable equals. And with this list, what we're setting this list equal to is question. This isn't any particular question, it's the class that holds our question. Now, this class is a Django model, and all Django models have a manager, which by default is called objects. This object manager helps us retrieve instances of our model. We'll also use the objects manager to create and delete models. Instances of models. This objects has an order by function, which we can use to retrieve our questions, and we're going to retrieve our questions ordered by pub date with the max number of 5. This format here in the square brackets is in Python, it's called slice. So this latest question list is a list of questions which we got from our question class using its manager called objects. But that doesn't do anything for our template yet. What we're going to do for our template is we're going to pass it another variable. That variable is called context, and context is a dictionary. A dictionary being a list of keys and values, and in Python that's defined by these curly braces. Here the key latest question list refers to the variable that we just defined, latest question list. The key and the variable name don't have to be the same, but for convenience in this case it makes sense to use the same name. And we're going to pass it to the template with this render function. Right, this request, it came from the URL when it called this function. Polls index.html, obviously the name of our template. And context, this is the name of the dictionary that we're passing to our template. All right, so let's take a look at that. Right, we'll have one question there, it's called what's up, and if we click on that, we get our other function. You are looking at question 1. We'll take another look at what happened here. In our template, we set up a link, that link was a URL polls with a question ID. This path here is defined in our URLs file. And this URL, the one that matched the pattern that had a question integer in it, referred to our detail function here that said you are looking at question and then question ID. All right, I want to skip around a couple of things in this tutorial just because there's some things that I feel should be presented in a different order. All right, so first, this part about removing hard-coded URLs and templates. And what that means is instead of building the path here in your template, as we did over here, we're going to refer to the path that we defined in the URLs file by the name that we gave it. Instead of href equals polls, it'll be href equals this function this detail here, go to URLs, is this name here, detail. All right, there's a couple of advantages of doing it that way. One is, well, I've already built the path in my URLs file, so there's no reason to rebuild it in the template. Another advantage is when you get into the habit of typing this URL helper function, this pattern, it becomes more natural than building the URL in the template. And another advantage is I might refer to this URL 20 times in a big project. And if I decide I want to change that, I could change it in URLs. For instance, let's say instead of just a question ID, I want the URL to be question ID detail. I just have to change that once in my URL file. I don't have to change it 20 times throughout my templates. So first, let me undo this. Go back to the way we were before, and you can see that. Go back to our polls list. Here's our polls question. Click on it. You can see it's the same thing that we had before. So making that change doesn't change anything in the real world. If I did decide to change that in my URL, go back and refresh this, and you'll see now this link refers to the URL that I just defined in my URLs file. And again, if I had that link 20 times in the templates, changing it in the URL file changes it in all of the templates. Oh, and proper terminology. These functions that are called in templates with the curly brace and % are called template tags. All right. Above the section where they talk about the URL template tag, they give us some code for a detail.html. One thing to note, and this is mentioned early in the tutorial, these aren't complete HTML files. This isn't something that you would actually put on the web in production. But they're good enough for this tutorial. All right, so let's make a detail.html by copying this file. And from templates, we're going to create a new file. I put this in the wrong place. I need to move it into the polls directory. Yes. Okay. Now we need to go back into views and redefine our detail view so that it refers to the template the same way the index view did. All right, so delete this line. I'll go back to the tutorial. And I'm going to copy these two lines in. And get object or 404 is covered in the tutorial. It's a shortcut for this try and accept block. And I just skipped over the part where they have us type the try and accept block and then delete it and replace it with a shortcut. All right, let's see how this looks. If we're looking at the list of questions, right now we only have one question. If we look at the list and we click on it, now we see the detail, instead of the part where it says you're looking at question 1. The reason we have no choices in our database yet is because they added choices in that part that I skipped over about playing with the API. And as much as I'm regretting skipping over this part, what they really should have done was add choices to the admin so that you can add choices in the admin panel, just like you added a question before. So unless I missed something, which I might have, they didn't add that to the admin, but we will add it right now. So going back to admin.py, we're going to import question and choice. And just like admin site register question, admin site register choice. And now when we go back to our admin panel, we can add choices. That dialog box that keeps popping up in the upper right-hand corner, that's just my password manager. That's not part of Django. And again, it's not displaying a useful string here, so we'll change that. Go back to our models. And we'll define a str function. Let's make sure that works. There we go. Let's go back to the polls app. All right, and that lists our choices. Well, it still isn't very useful because your visitors can't do anything with this. They can't vote on which choice they like better. So that's covered coming up. The next section of the tutorial is going to go over getting user input through forms. And with this form, the user will not just see a question and see the choices, the user will be able to vote on which choice they like best. Before we go on, I need to go over one thing that I accidentally skipped. And this was their section about namespacing. This tutorial just has one app and it's called Polls, but a Django project might have lots and lots of apps in it. And you can have a view in another app that has the name detail. And you might have to tell your templates or other functions that this detail is referring specifically to the polls detail. So in order to make that happen, you add an app name. And since the app name is polls, we add this app name equals polls to our URLs file. And then in our template, instead of just detail, we call it polls detail. And that makes sure that we don't clash with any other app that might also have a URL that's named detail. So I'm going to go ahead and make that fix right now. And that's called namespacing. All right, so let's go add that form. Right here they have an example of a form, and we're just going to copy it, and I'm going to put this into the detail HTML template. And go here, detail.html, delete everything, and paste what we just copied. Right, this template has a URL called vote. And if we take a look at our URLs file, we put this in here. This is the URL with the name vote, and it refers to a function called vote in our views file. And as you see, this function doesn't do anything. It just says you're voting on question whatever. Let's go see what happens. Click on what's up, and we hit vote, and it says you are voting on question 1. All right, well, that isn't very helpful. So let's go on to the next step. In our views, we're going to replace the vote function with a function that actually does something with the user input. All right, now might be a good time to take a closer look at this request here and what that is. Every Django view takes in a request, so it's always the first parameter here, and it always returns some kind of response. And this request includes basically everything that comes in from the user's browser. So for instance, if we go back to where I voted, and I pull up Firefox's inspector, and take a look at this network, and I'm going to hit my vote button again. And when I clicked on vote, this is what Firefox did. It submitted all of this stuff, including this request, which included a token that I'll go over in a minute, and it included this choice, which is choice 2. And the request also includes the URL, which was up here. And all of that got submitted to our function, vote. And I'll go over the token. I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier in the video, so if I did, sorry for repeating myself. But this Csrf token is a security feature, and it just makes sure that it prevents attacks. What it does is it generates a big random number. And if I was using a robot to inject information to this view, I wouldn't be able to know what number Django's expecting. And so if I don't have a proper Csrf token in my robot, then Django's going to reject my input. All right, but let's go ahead and put this into our new view. I'm just going to copy this part. And because there's a new function in here, which is reverse, we're going to have to import that. All right, so a quick look at what this question does, and probably be easier to see from the website here. All right, So what this question does is, well, or what this view does, we get our question, and this PK came from our path in the URLs file. If a question comes in, or if a question ID comes in for a question that doesn't exist, we return a 404. But if we're good, we go on and check the choice. So the user's choice, you saw that submitted here, choice equals 2. And that came in as as the post variable with the name choice. We're going to make sure that the selected choice, we're going to make sure that there is a selected choice which matches the ID that came in. If the choice doesn't exist, it's going to throw an error. And we're going to return a message, you didn't select a choice. Otherwise, we're going to add to the votes. We're going to add to the votes in the choice. Now, where did these votes come from? We define that in our model. We'll take a look at our model real quick. And as you see, our choice has votes. It's an integer field that starts off as 0, but what this view will do is it will increment it. Right? Once we've incremented the choice, we save it, and now it goes into the database, and we return a response. Now this reverse function, that does pretty much the same thing that the URL function did in our template, or the URL template tag, but in our Python code, we use reverse. Oh, and I imported reverse. We also have to import HTTP response redirect. I don't think I did that. So let's go back to our view and make sure. There we go. In fact, let me just, I forgot to import this before. Let's go back to me forgetting to import that. So I have something that's listed here, but I forgot to import it. And if I go back to my view, what's going to happen is I'm going to get an error. Let me close this out here. Is Django will give me an error, and it says this is not defined. So if you see is not defined, there's a good chance that you forgot to import something. So I'm going to go back to my view and import it. And if I refresh this, resend, now that should be fine. All right, so now you're looking at, well, we've got this string that says you're looking at the results of question 1. And again, that's not very helpful, but we're going to define this view to make it something more useful. All right, so moving on in the tutorial. We've got this part here. This is the results view. I'll just copy it from here into our views. And we have a new template, results.html. Copy this whole thing. Go into our templates folder, which is where we are, templates polls, new file, results.html. And let's go back to our view and refresh. Look at that, something big got 5 votes. nothing much. And now nothing much has 1 vote. Had there something big at 5 votes already? Well, I'm not sure, but I was playing around a bit and probably clicked up the votes there. But the bottom line is this will increment every time we make a vote. And remember that error message that we had? That'll show up. Ooh. Oh, you know what happened here? I forgot to import choice into my view here. From models, import choice question. Go ahead and refresh this. Okay, and you get an error message that says you did not select a choice. All right, so let's take a look at this display HTML and let's get a better look about what's going on. All right, so it starts off. Actually, first let's go back up here for a moment. Okay, so this is our polls detail. And remember when I didn't click on a choice, and I'm not talking about that big error message that came up, but when I got this functioning right, and yet I didn't select a choice and I hit enter, that's when we saw this error message that said, you didn't select a choice. Now going back down in our results view, all right, so the question is what came up here. Let's go. All right, question here, what's up? And now for choice in choice set all, I didn't really go over this before. This was in our template earlier. This hasn't changed, but I didn't discuss this. Every time you have a foreign key to a model, let's take a look at our models quickly. I have choice. Choice has a foreign key to question. And if choice has a foreign key to question, then question will automatically have created in it an object called a related manager, and this related manager will be named choice set. And all is a function in choice set, which will bring all of the choices that are related to that question. In the Django templating language, in Python, we would always follow a function with parentheses. In the Django templating language, there are no parentheses. Right, so that's where that choice set all comes from. Right, the rest is pretty simple. For all of the choices in the choice set, display the choice, display the votes. And this pluralize here is a filter. Basically, it adds an S if the votes are more than 1. And we'll go over more about template filters in the next video. All right, but this tutorial is getting on. I think we're past an hour. We have an app that, well, it does something, and we'll do more in the next video.